Hot on the heels of the Silverstone Grand Prix, 2024 has become an incredibly exciting season. The pack is tighter than it's ever been, which means that the championships will be won or lost on fine margins. Being off the pace by just a couple tenths can mean the difference between starting near the front or deep into the midfield. And unfortunately for Perez, he's just not known for finding those extra tenths in qualifying. In fact, one could argue that Checo is a Mr. Sunday, a man who's known for his racecraft and also for being the Mexican Minister of Defense and the patron saint of tire management. But with all those things combined, it's pretty clear that he put all of his skill points into talents that help him on race day. It's why he's one of only 6 drivers in history to pull a last to first victory in Formula One. There is no question that Checo can handle himself in a Grand Prix. But that just isn't enough anymore. In the current era, you can't afford to botch quali because even if you nail it, you might still lose out on positions by a few hundredths or even thousandths, so you can't leave anything on the table. We know that Max likes a car with a twitchy rear end, and whoever drives the car alongside him has to leave a little bit of margin so they don't spin out because their ass can't sense oversteer the way Max's can. But there just isn't space for that kind of buffer anymore. And given the recent gains in pace from McLaren and Mercedes, even Max can't guarantee that he can make up positions in the Grand Prix anymore. In Silverstone, he started 4th and ended 2nd thanks to George's mechanical DNF. So realistically, he only made up a single position. Given Max's talent and synergy with the car, there is no reason to believe that Checo could do any better. And he didn't. And he hasn't been. He started from the pit lane and ended in 17th. But once you remove the 2 DNFs, that means he only finished ahead of a single car. That's not good enough. If you find yourself thinking, these criticisms sound suspiciously similar to the ones Daniel Ricciardo received at McLaren, you'd be correct. And you'd also be right to wonder why I still want to see him swapped into Red Bull as soon as possible. And I'll get to that. But first, let's rewind to 2023, when Checo was still consistently falling short in qualifying, but the car was good enough to allow him to make up the difference on race day. He had the car underneath him to make his way back up the grid and finished 2nd place in the WDC. Barely. Lewis managed to give him a run for his money in a seriously inferior car, and that's what opened up the door for Danny Ric to start sniffing around again. 2024 started off looking like it was going to be Red Bull dominance all over again. And we all felt it. I even made a video about how repetitive F1 was getting, but I never released it because that all ended after 4 races. We have now had 6 different winners and we're only halfway into the season. It's a great time to be watching Formula One because anybody could end up on top of the podium. In fact, people are even able to enjoy Verstappen victories now that they're not a guarantee. But this makes things even worse for Perez because he didn't make the best of those first races when his car was still the best on the grid. And he's now on a solid trajectory to take 8th place in the WDC as both Mercedes drivers are poised to pass him in the next race or two. 8th place! In the same car as the guy who's almost certainly going to win the whole shebang. The only thing more embarrassing than that would be... Well, I wanted to write a punchline for that, but I actually genuinely couldn't think of anything. If you can think of something more embarrassing than that, let me know in the comments. What I find more astonishing than Perez's poor performance is Red Bull's choice to renew his contract so early this season. At the time they re-signed Checo, Yuki was killing it, but I understand why they don't want to put Yuki in the top team. He's toxic, and almost certainly ended any chance he had of being Max's teammate when he swerved at Danny earlier this year. Anybody who can get that toxic with a sweetheart like Ricciardo is almost certainly going to poison the well as soon as he's put alongside someone as cold, aggressive, and unforgiving as Max Verstappen. And Red Bull knows this. Honestly, I think that's why they chose to keep Checo. Perez poses no threat to Verstappen, and given the recent internal power struggles at Red Bull, signing Sergio over Sainz feels a lot more like political maneuvering. They wanted to show Max that he's still clearly number 1 and won't be challenged. And it'll also help him secure the WDC this season, as he won't be up against someone who will be putting their car ahead of him. But is this a smart move for Red Bull? If all you care about is retaining your top talent, then yes. It is. They will almost certainly be celebrating Max's Drivers' Championship before the season is over, but it may come at the cost of the Constructors' Championship. Red Bull currently leads Ferrari by 71 points, and McLaren by 78. McLaren has been crushing it recently, and both their drivers are filling their boots while they have all this pace in hand. Lando has been lauded as Max's newest challenger, and it's only a matter of time before Piastri wins his first race. He's not a rookie anymore, and his performance proves it. Speaking of Oscars-worthy performances, as you may recall, McLaren spent millions of dollars to bench the underperforming has-been that was Daniel Ricciardo and Papaya to put Piastri in that seat. And that gamble has been paying off. If Danny Ric was still at McLaren, performing the way Checo is at Red Bull, McLaren wouldn't even be in the discussion for the Constructors' Championship. Yet, here they are, firing on all cylinders, ready to take the fight to Max. I say to Max instead of to Red Bull, because Max is single-handedly keeping Red Bull in this fight, and Perez is single-handedly keeping Red Bull close enough to McLaren for them to catch up. The last time Perez finished outside the midfield was in Miami when he took 4th, and his last podium was in China. This type of garbage tier performance is why McLaren sacked Ricciardo. Red Bull might as well not even be entering a second car at this point. One could argue that he's doing more damage than good by showing off the Red Bull floor all the time. I think it gives Red Bull the license to do something drastic, because at this point, it would be hard to find someone who could do worse. Following Silverstone, Checo is 137 points behind his teammate, and if the rumors are to be believed, his contract stipulates that he needs to be within 100 points of Max by Monza, or he loses his contract. If that's true, it means he has just 4 races to close a 37-point gap with the best driver on the grid, and no mechanical advantage. He could win all 4 races, and it wouldn't matter if Max still got second place, which you know he would if the car is capable of winning. So there's a lot of debate as to who should go into the second Red Bull. I've already said why I don't think it'll be Yuki, and there are a lot of other good options like Liam Lawson, but I can make a great case for putting Danny Ric in it. And the reasons may surprise you. We all know Christian Horner loves Daniel Ricciardo, at least as much as he loves sending uncomfortable text messages to his employees. Horner is the primary reason the 35-year-old has a seat in the junior team when that really should have gone to Liam Lawson. Or stayed with Nick DeVries, but let's not get into that. I don't feel like crying today. Daniel Ricciardo was once the hotness that everyone touted as a future world champion, but he saw Red Bull lining up behind Verstappen and cast out on his own to find a team that would throw their support behind him. He found it at Renault, and then left for greener pastures at McLaren, but just couldn't gel with the car. It's obvious at this point that he lacks adaptability and needs a car that drives like a Red Bull to get the most out of it. Does this mean he deserves a shot at Red Bull? As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't. But as much as he doesn't deserve the Red Bull seat, I think he deserves that V-Carb seat even less. Red Bull shouldn't be allowed to own 2 teams. And the only reason they've been able to get away with it up until this point was because one was a junior team. You can't keep up that pretense when you've had one of those drivers for 4 years and the other one is a 35-year-old with over 13 years of experience. Danny Ric's seat rightfully belongs to a junior driver, and I want to see him out of it. The only reason he's in that seat in the first place is because he jumped in the RB19 during a tire test and set a lap that was on par with Max's pole lap at the same track in the same car. He showed he still has the pace when the pressure's off, but does that mean he can do the same thing under pressure? No, but obviously the possibility is still there. And I'm tired of hearing about the guy and how he might take Checo's seat. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a toilet seat, and they need to shit or get off the pot. It's time to put Danny in the Red Bull and put all the speculation to rest. There is literally no downside to this. If Danny does well, then Red Bull gets a huge win. He almost certainly will get along better with Max, given their prior friendship when they were teammates before, and it's a massive PR win. Most importantly though, we can see if Danny is truly washed, or if he actually was just in the wrong car all this time. We can move on from hearing about Perez, Lawson can get the drive he deserves, and by the end of this season, if Danny isn't performing, Red Bull can make a properly informed decision about who they want in their second car. By the end of this season, there will be no question as to whether Danny still got it, or if it's time for him to move on. And I am so ready to move on from speculating about Daniel Ricciardo and the second Red Bull seat. The proof will be in the performance. But if the proof is in the performance, then there's no excusing Checo being 137 points behind his teammate. And here to talk about that is the Canadian Positivity Guy. In the last 20 years, my country has produced 2 Formula One drivers, and both of them were billionaire nepo babies who didn't deserve their seat. Nicholas Latifi was never F1 tier, but a really great guy, and Lance Stroll has flashes of competence, but is still very clearly not good enough for a driver of his experience. We're on year 7 of Lance being in F1, and he's only scored 34% of his team's points. Sure, he's up against Fernando Alonso, but the consensus across the board from everyone who talks about the sport is it's time for him to move on. So what does that say about a driver who's only scored 31% of his team's points? That's right, I'm also dunking on Checo. The fact that I can say Lance Stroll is outperforming Sergio Perez in any metric is the harshest criticism I can lay at his feet. If Sergio Perez was a social movement, he'd be quiet quitting. If he was a browser, he'd be Internet Explorer. If Checo was a sex move, he'd be starfishing. This week, for the poll of the week, I asked, who's winning in Silverstone? Roughly a quarter of respondents said Lewis, another quarter said Max, and a third said Lando, which leaves only 10% choosing George Russell, even though he was on pole and won the race just before this. Honestly, this fits perfectly with the public perception of George Russell. He's not a closer. He doesn't get things done. He can snipe a victory when he's in the right place at the right time, but even before he started losing his coolant in Silverstone, he'd already lost his grip on the victory. I'm happy for Lewis, but more than anything, I'm bummed for George. This guy can't get any respect, and despite his immense talent, he often fumbles whenever he has the opportunity to take a victory on pure merit. It's just easier to believe in Max or Lando or even Lewis because those guys are consistent in their pace and rarely make big mistakes the way George does. I actually talked about all this in my last video, so if you want to hear my thoughts on those guys, pop by this video next. I'll see you there.